Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Sinclair of the ML2LeadA University School of Public Health. Let's talk about leadership. I will first cover the first chapter of the book called Public Health Leadership. That first chapter defines leadership, goes over leadership essentials, and then discusses 16 leadership principles. I'm going to cover the 5 essentials and a select few of the principles. So this can be an especially dry exercise without any kind of practical example. So I'm going to select a few leadership stories to help explain these concepts. I chose Queen Esther and Herb Keller as potential candidates. Herb Keller was the CEO of Southwest Airlines in the late 1980s to early 2000s. He passed away recently. Before we jump into the examples, let's go over the 5 essential skills of a leader. The first one is to develop an understanding from as many angles as possible. This is also the category that data and analytics falls into. Leaders have to know how to interpret data. The second essential skill is about emotional intelligence. This skill requires you to know how to work with people, understand other people, and have them actually trust you, respect you, and possibly like you. It's hard to do that without first understanding the people who you're leading, so you need to do your homework about who you're working with. Okay, the next one, a strong leader will take risks and make actions to move the organization towards your goals, whether it is profit, social justice, or any other goal. The important part here is that the leader is willing to make sacrifices and take risks. Ideally, these risks should be based on the understanding that you have of the data and the science behind your decision. You should also communicate well on other platforms, including in person, public speaking, writing, and social media. Your messages need to be consistent and concise with your defined goals. You should also be a systems thinker where you can really understand what your role means and how to move your organization forward. You should understand all details of the situation and systematically forecast possibilities of potential actions. The last item I have is not listed as an essential skill in our textbook, but I like to include it as an important skill that all leaders should cultivate. Everyone needs to learn from mistakes and to have a formalized system to make improvements based on lessons learned. In the Old Testament of the Bible and in the Torah, there is a story of Queen Esther. That story provides a good example to understand the backdrop of the leadership essentials I have listed above. Briefly, King Xerxes holds a banquet and requires his queen to come and show her beauty, but she declines and she was removed from her position as queen. The king then holds a new selection of young women throughout the empire and chooses a Jewish orphan named Esther to be part of his harem. She was raised by her uncle Mordecai. So they were both Jewish and in hiding, and the king didn't know it. Mordecai worked as a guard by the palace gate and one day prevented 2 other palace employees from killing the king. Mordecai had Esther tell the king, and then Esther was loved by the king and became the new queen. She took the king's decree to be the new queen and studied it before she agreed. Later, the viceroy named Haman, who doesn't really like Mordecai, found out that Mordecai is a Jew, and then he convinced the king to have all the Jews killed. Mordecai was Esther's mentor and convinced her to stand up for her hidden ethnicity and stop Haman's plan. She invited Haman and the king to a banquet. By doing this, she was taking a big risk because anyone who approaches the king without a summons could be executed. She convinced them both, the king and Haman, to come to the banquet, and then, while Haman wasn't listening, told the king how it was Mordecai who gave the information about someone attempting to kill the king. The king was pleased with this and asked Haman how he should honor someone that he wants to thank. Haman thought it was for him and gave the wrong answer about himself. The king was displeased by that. And then at that moment, Esther stepped forward and strategically unveiled more information about her ethnicity and Haman's plan. The king executed Haman and not Mordecai as originally planned. The decree to kill all the Jews was stopped. So there's much more to this story, but I believe that's enough to talk about for some of the leadership components. So Esther, she exemplified leadership in several ways during this story, and it is one of the most common biblical leadership lessons. I'll use it again to discuss what the five essentials of leadership are. For understanding, Esther was able to understand the problem and the urgency required for her actions. When she was asked to be queen, she studied the king's decree and better realized what her leadership allowed her to do as a queen. Her strength was most notable for the emotional intelligence skill. She was able to predict the king's behaviors and desires and then the possible reactions from Haman. She wasn't able to do this alone, and she was humble also in accepting her mentoring from her uncle Mordecai. The entire story is about the risks she took. Failure at any point during your plan could have meant execution. The most notable part was where she approached the king to request his presence at the banquet. If he was annoyed to see her or didn't want to see her for some reason, she could have been executed on the spot. Being in a harem and not running away or objecting to the king's advances as well, that also must have been extremely difficult. So the risks that she took and the difficulty that she put herself in definitely categorized her as a leader. She was also, of course, a great communicator and able to craft the plan and deliver messages to all the appropriate people in the palace to help her with her plan. She was also able to communicate with Mordecai and then understand and receive his wise advice. Esther was a big picture thinker. Many believe that one of the reasons she took the position as the queen was to have an influence over the Persian Empire and the Persian Empire's treatment of the Jews. She was strategic in her purpose and able to ultimately save the Jews from a plan which would have had many of them executed. Further study shows the story is not as simple as I've presented it. There are many caveats, but overall, I think Esther is my favorite leader example that I could find from the Bible. Remember, there is one more essential of leadership, and that's the continual quality improvement. I'm sure Esther had that skill as well, but it's not detailed in the book of Esther. So let's move on and talk about public health leadership principles. There are 16 principles listed in the textbook, and I would like to cover just a few of them. The principle one is that a public health leader should aim to strengthen infrastructure by using the core functions and the 10 essential services as a guide for what changes should occur in the future. The core functions of public health are in the categories of assessment, policy development, and assurance. The topics in those can change and are always interdisciplinary. Those three core functions also dictate how the 10 essential services are prioritized. A leader is able to evaluate the core functions and determine which of the essential services needs the most work. This is designed during a reoccurring session of strategic planning that the organization might have. So the mix-up comes when you're in public health and then there's an emergency or a disaster scenario. The role of public health figures may not be well defined here, and then it's going to be up to the public health leader to quickly reprioritize based on what's happening. The book lists the second principle with a goal to improve the health of each person in the community, but to also reach out to local institutions and the community so that they can help define what the vision of healthcare and health actually means for that community. So before a leader makes any decision or acts, the community should be engaged to define their own health priorities. A good leader will never assume a complete understanding of the community health priorities. Leadership is about partnerships and giving the community a voice to define their own health priorities. So, leaders are also committed to lifelong learning and their own personal growth. So, this eighth principle listed in the textbook discusses SETI's 7 R's of self esteem, which are to cultivate respect in your employees, delegate responsibility among people who you work with, take risks to build innovation, recognize and reward accomplishments of people you work with, encourage quality relationships among coworkers and partners, role model your work practices, according to the organization's values, and keep renewal in mind. In other words, lifelong learning often means relearning. So, again, that was respect, responsibility, risks, recognize, relationships, role modeling, and renewal. One of the challenges I have with understanding leadership and how to be a good leader is that there is so much good advice from so many different authors and organizations. We just learned about the 7 R's and the 5 essentials, and now we're going through the 16 principles. How can you make sense of all of that and know which one to choose? So that's a problem that's managed through another leadership principle. If you keep renewal in mind, you will undoubtedly prioritize what is important or the most effective for you, and also what is the most meaningful for you. You should just simply remember that there's always ways to improve. You just have to figure out what that is. So, moving on from there, another reference in Principle 15 states that our US based contemporary culture is focused on individualism and that we've lost our sense of community. That's a contemporary view and may be true in many areas and many regions, but I tend to be more optimistic on that. And a good leader will always engage diverse cultures and often find that some communities are much more cohesive than others. The notions of individualism and sense of community is always variable. The last slide I have for you is from the case study at the end of the chapter. The author had interviewed Dr. Virginia Kane of Marion County, Indiana. She'd been the leader to promote some very innovative public health programs and had some candid things to say about what is important in public health leadership. The main thing that she emphasizes is that a good leader will have everyone know what the leader's vision is and what the vision stands for. So let's move past what the textbook says, and let me just say a few more final words here. Let's look at one final leadership example. I would much rather talk about a leader that I wouldn't mind working for than talk about a leader and one of those popular leaders that people write books about all the time. So let's move past the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs and those examples and go to something else. Herb Kelleher was the CEO and president of Southwest Airlines from 1981 to about 2006 or so. Without going into too much detail, the biggest achievement for him was on the emotional intelligence side and also his risk taking. One of his main components was that he wanted his workers to be happy because he knew that if his workers were happy, the customers would be happy. His goal was achieved, and Southwest made a profit every year. That's something unheard of in the airline industry. So I encourage you to look through the internet and find some additional lessons you can learn from him. There's a lot of interesting stories and pictures of him out there. He's really so